So welcome to our lecture today, which is going to be about the phallus, the Oedipus, and Lacan in general. What we're going to talk about today has to do with some work that we have been doing in our guided reading group. So a work on a specific article called The Signification of the Phallus, which Lacan published in Écrit. So we did some work. We're going to demonstrate that, a little bit of that, but then we're going to go a bit further. And yeah, again, feel free to participate and ask questions, and we'll see where we get to. I have several ideas of where I want to take the lecture, but again, we could take it anywhere. I'll represent myself briefly. My name is Leon Brenner. Thank you, yes. I'm a PhD candidate and an expert on, or let's say an autism theorist. That's what my work revolves, theory of autism. And also I love Lacan dearly, and I've been working on Lacan for years. That's part of the reason that we're doing this lecture today. Yeah, so let's start. Okay, so when we think about the phallus, it's a really big deal in psychoanalysis, at least, or anywhere, I guess. Everybody wants to have the phallus, to know what is the phallus. And I think the significance of the phallus is greatly diminished in a very Freudian joke, which is also a horrible joke, but it's a Freudian joke about the phallus. And it goes pretty much like this. Anna Freud, which is Freud's daughter and a very famous analyst to be, is sitting in the living room with Freud in their apartment in Vienna. That's before she became an analyst. So she's a very inquisitive woman, and she asks Freud, Dad, can you tell me what is the phallus? And Freud says, yes, no problem, obviously, but in order to do that, we need to step into my office. They step into Freud's office. He goes behind his desk, unzips his pants, and takes his pants off. And he tells Anna, this is the phallus. And then Anna says, and this is the punchline of the joke, she said, oh, so the phallus is just like the penis, but smaller. So, yeah, so this is like a kind of a horrible joke, but it really shows us what Freud was aiming for when he was talking about the phallus. Freud was talking about the penis, right? An actual part of the body. And what Freud was saying, that the penis is the biological marker for the psychological difference between men and women. Okay, so we have to differentiate these two things. It's not a biological marker of the, let's say, biological difference between men and women. Freud was taking it one step further and was saying it is all about the psychology of sexuality. And what Freud was actually saying, that the phallus plays a really crucial role in what is called the castration complex, which is a very big deal in the child's development, and also in what Freud defined as the Oedipus complex, which we'll get back to soon, but let's do a brief introduction of that. So Freud was saying, like, the Oedipus, and you enter the Oedipus, and let's say the drama of the Oedipus has a lot to do with the phallus. And it's different for boys and girls. Castration is different for boys and girls. Let's say for boys, the castration complex or castration anxiety has to do with them exiting the Oedipus complex. Okay, they get into the Oedipus, they sort of notice that mommy or their sister doesn't have one. They get pretty anxious of, why will somebody take it from me? And at the point where the castration complex is resolved, the boys, they get out of the Oedipus complex, intact, hopefully. Okay. So for boys, it's about concluding the Oedipus. For girls, it starts the Oedipus. Because girls get into the Oedipus after they already have lost that thing. Let's say mommy took it. Okay, mommy took it from the get-go, and the Oedipus starts, and the whole idea is to sort of to compensate. So both sides, it's a compensation, but then there's a different kind of compensation. This is very, very briefly Freud and the phallus in this whole drama. So we see the phallus has a very, very important role in the organization of children's sexuality from a very, very early age. A lot of questions about that. In that sense, Freud has said the very famous quote, "Anatomy is destiny." There is something about the biological essence of sexuality which portrays or defines the psychological destiny of men and women. So that's Freud. And for Lacan, which we're going to mostly discuss today, anatomy is destiny if we take into consideration that the phallus is a signifier. So anatomy is destiny if the phallus is a signifier. Okay, that's the bottom line here. Now there's a very famous quote from the article "The Signification of the Phallus," where, and this is a paraphrase, Lacan says, the phallus is a signifier, explicitly. And he also says that it's not a regular signifier, but it's a unique signifier. A signifier designating meaning effects as a whole. That is a quote. Now, Lacan also says in direct relation to that, that the only way to understand Freud's idea of the unconscious is by thinking about signifiers, right? So this very crucial moment of anatomical destiny is turned into linguistics, into the field of linguistics, and we have to know something very crucial about that before we progress into the Oedipus and understanding the role of the phallus in the Oedipus. So just generally speaking about signifiers, let's think about language. Let's think about how language works, and we'll sort of divide it into three stages, let's say, in our understanding of language. So if any of you have read Foucault's The Order of Things, he discusses that specifically there, that at a certain point in history, and we can relate that to religion, words, signifiers, were considered to have a direct relationship to things. Not as a representative of things, even just directly embodying things. Now, I usually relate that to the Jewish religion, which, you know, the first creation of the universe, according to the Jewish religion, was a sentence, was a saying. It was God saying, "Let there be light." So the weight of words for the Jewish religion, let's say, has a metaphysical dimension. A word is a manifestation. And in Jewish religion, there are several ways to read the Bible, let's say. And if you progress in this ladder, you finally get to a level where words are actually things, even letters. So when we read the universe, we can find the same, everything that we see around us manifest in language. Not a representative, but a real presentation, a direct presentation. So that would be one way to look at language, as directly presenting what exists. Language and existence sort of are equivalent. Now, a second way to look at it, which is more familiar to us, is what I would call maybe naive empiricism. In this sense, the empiricist would say words are not direct presentations of an object. There's a relationship between a word and an object, a relationship of representation. So I have a word in my mind, or a concept, or a signifier, and that signifier sort of points out to the outer world and says, yeah, this is what I mean. So a tree would actually mean a tree. So it actually points to a tree. Right? So there is a relationship between concepts, words, signifiers, and objects, but it's a relationship of representation. Now, the final field I want to present today, and this is the field that Lacan was really working hard on, is a field that's called semiotics. And that's a form of linguistics which sort of started showing its face in the last century, and major figures in this field would be Peirce, Charles Peirce, Roman Jakobson, and Ferdinand de Saussure, which all of these Lacan has specifically associated himself with. Now, according to semiotics, the first thing that we need to remember is that there is no relationship between concepts, words, and things. There is no relationship. There is no equivalence. There isn't even a relationship of representation between these two. According to semiotics, both the word and the thing are psychological elements. They're in our minds. Okay? So you see how we're stepping back from metaphysics. We're stepping back from the existence of things. We're now in the field of language as what creates reality, right? And accordingly, there is no link between a word and an object. And what we do have is a link between what this Saussure calls a sound image and what we could say is meaning, or let's say concept here. Okay, so a sound image would be just let's say a chunk of phonemes or sounds, and this would have a relationship to concepts. There's a famous drawing, signified and signifier, and sort of like there's a relationship there. The idea is that signifiers and the signifier and the signified, they have, let's say, arbitrary relationship. The fact that I use the word mutton, and in English it means the meat of, help me here, of a sheep, right? But in French it's the meat of a sheep, but if I'm not mistaken, it also means a sheep. So this same sound image, yeah, does not have a necessary relationship with the concepts or the meaning that is manifest when we use it. It's arbitrary and it changes, right? There is a weak link between the two. Now, something very interesting about this Saussure is the fact that he claimed that meaning in general is not a signifier and a signified, let's say, not like, let's say, the word cat and the concept cat. Meaning is engendered by relationships between signifiers. And more than that, it's a differential relationship between signifiers. So it's not that I have this concept cat or this word cat, and then there's this concept cat in my mind or something like that. It is many, many signifiers, let's say fur, let's say clean or annoying, etc., which interact in some sense and eventually create meaning. So through the differential relationship between signifiers, we have meaning for us. So, if this is a signifier and the signified, now we need to understand that the phallus is a signifier, right? Now that's very important to understand, because if we think that the phallus is signified, then we need to look for it somewhere, right? It would have a meaning. But then Lacan said it is a signifier, but not only just a regular signifier, but an empty signifier. So this means it's a signifier with no signified. So how is this possible? And this is a bit strange, right? When we think about the phallus, it's such a deliberated concept. Everybody's talking about it, let's say in psychoanalysis at least, and Lacan is saying that's an empty signifier, right? So how do we understand a signifier that has no meaning, But on the other hand, Lacan explicitly says it designates meaning effects in general. So it has no meaning, but it sort of says, you know, if we simplify it, it says there is meaning going on here somewhere, right? So it's not a specific meaning, it's not cat, let's say, it is amongst these signifiers, among the field of signifier, meaning happens. Now, an interesting example to sort of wrap our minds around this is to think about the chain of signifiers. Okay, think about this chain. Like we're thinking about the signifiers like there is a first signifier, then some more signifiers, etc., etc. That's the chain of signifiers. And when they interact, we sort of have meaning, right? When different signifiers interact, they create meaning. They create the signified. Right. Now the question is, what happens with the first signifier? So when we have 1,000 signifiers, we can create many signified, many meanings. But what happens when we only have the first? Any ideas? Just off the top of your head. Like, how would the first signifier behave? What would be its meaning? Yeah. So the only, actually excellent answer, like terrific answer, the only thing that the first signifier can signify is its relationship to the rest of the chain, right? So there's no meaning that can be engendered other than the fact that through this relationship, through this initial relationship to the chain of signifiers, meaning is constituted. We can start speaking. Or the world can start to manifest, because you know, if the world, if our conscious reality is signified, yeah, this means hello reality, like hello world, right? So that's how it happens, yeah, according to this way we look at signifiers. Again, it's important to remember that a lot of concepts in the Lacanian teaching are much more intricate than we think they are. For instance, the first signifier, that has a completely different signifier in the Lacanian schema. It's called S1, and it's different than the phallus. We won't say it's the phallus, right? But we do need to think of the phallus as an empty signifier, not in the sense that it doesn't exist. It exists as a signifier, but it's empty because the only thing that it can designate is, here we go, that's the rest of the chain. Yeah?
So could it be as zero?
Right, so that's a terrific question, again, because you're taking us to the field of math, and Lacan is doing that exactly, because this question is asked, so is it zero? And a great question to ask ourselves is, where does counting start, right? Do we start counting by 0? Do we start with 1? Do we start with 2? 3 is already too much, right? But when does actual counting start? I don't think there's a definite answer here, right?
The question is open. We can see it by numbering the levels in different countries. In many countries it starts from 1, in many countries it starts from 0. So
it's true.
Uncertainty is international.
Right, yeah. Well, if we have time, we'll even connect that to what Lacan calls sexuation, to feminine and masculine desire, right? It's sort of the answer to this question. It gets different answers when we look at it from a feminine or masculine perspectives, according to psychoanalysis, and we're talking about sexuation, which is something different. But let's just talk about set theory. There we go. If we talk about a certain version of set theory, how do we count? How do we count according to set theory? There's a thing that's called an empty set, right? And an empty set can be counted or not. So an empty set is empty, and when I write it like this, I don't even count it. I don't count it as one empty set. But if I include it in a set, then I count it as 1. So this is the number 1. When I count an empty set for the first time, when I include an empty set in a set, right? This is sort of a transition. So where does counting start? From including the empty set in a set or from the empty set itself. How do I count 2? I count the set with the empty set and another empty set. That would be 2, right? So this guy, which, I don't know, like in our reading group, somebody has remarked that it really resembles this letter phi, which represents the phallus in Lacan. This guy, this empty guy, this guy that if we don't count it in the series, actually is completely empty. Yeah? So this guy is very important. It appears in all the numbers. Right? When I count from 1 to million, it will always appear there, but it will not appear as a set. It will appear right here as the beginning, let's say, as the first signifier, which is always there. So the phallus is always there. That's obvious, right? But it's always there in our construction of reality. And that's the big deal about the phallus according to Lacan. That it is the first signifier. It is like it's a signifier that if we have the chain of signifiers and let's say the signified, which is always sliding beneath it, it's because the relationship between the signifier and the signified, they're not constant. They're not rooted in nature, you know, like some people would believe that a word is given by God. It's necessarily related to the objects in the world. It's not an accident that a tree is called a tree. Yeah. There are a lot of games in Hebrew you can play with words and the numbers, their worth, and you can add them up. There's some interesting games you can do with that. But here in semiotics would say no, there is no concrete relationship between the signifier and the signified, and the phallus is that nail that sort of like it nails the signified to the signified. It makes sure that we won't go crazy, you know, that we won't lose the meaning of the world. So it's very important. Right, we'll come back to the phallus as a nail in a second, okay? Because I think it's an interesting metaphor. Now, in order to understand the phallus, and Lacan really diverts the discussion in the article, the signification of the phallus, to this sort of conceptualization, we need to sort of think of the first moments of language, which is the same as saying the first moments of existence. And in this domain, we're talking about what Lacan designates in the words need, demand, and desire, which is something we've always also done some work in our group. So let's think about it. It's sort of a story. It's a metaphorical story that we're going to tell right now about the first moments of a baby in the world. A human baby, not a fish baby or a cow baby, because it's completely different from them. When a baby is born, and let's say any human born into this world has what we can define as instinctual needs or needs. These are needs which are crucial for the survival of the organism, right? For instance, food, right? Sleep, I don't know. Well, we'll get to love in a second, right? I would agree in some sense, but let's keep that in the more organismic level. That's the level of the body, but it's sort of a mythical body, you know? Because when we talk about the body has arms, legs, it's high, it's short. These are already signifiers. You see, these are already signifiers which color the body. When I talk about the body in this sense, I'm sort of mythically talking about the body as this sum of excitations or whatever that is. I can't really wrap my mind around it without resorting to language, right? But it's sort of like this primordial mass of what scientists call cells, which is also language as well. So it's something even previous does. Very mythical. It's I don't know. Nobody knows. So there's this body, and it has needs, let's say, and a baby, unfortunately, is born into the world when it's not ready to pacify its own needs. It's kind of a silly silly like a pack of meat, a baby doesn't do a lot. If a baby is hungry, if somebody won't feed the baby, that's not going to really help out. It's going to die, right? So the only way that a baby can pacify its needs is by making an appeal to the caretaker, right? How does a baby appeal to the caretaker? It screams, cries, right? Or in another sense, it uses language. So a cry would already be a signifier, right? It signifies something, right? So we can say that we add here another dimension. So if this is the dimension of need, this is where language comes in and takes the need and sort of tells us something about the need to the caretaker. Yeah? Lacan calls this a demand. So a demand is an articulated need, or is an attempt to articulate a need. It's when language sort of interferes in the very, very nice and terrific way that, let's say, nature just works. Language interferes. It's crucial. Without this interference, there will not be any life. Yeah? But when it interferes, something gets a little screwed up. Okay. But anyways, the baby uses a demand in order to say something about his needs. So it cries and it means, I'm hungry. Okay, or it cries again, it means, I don't know, I want change, I need a change of a diaper, etc., etc. So again, I'm talking about this point where a need intersects with a demand, where a demand articulates a need that has to be satisfied. But what Lacan argues is that when a baby cries, it doesn't only cry in order to pacify a need. So there's something more than this in a demand. And this has to do with the presence and absence of the caretaker. Right? So like you said, demand is not only a demand to pacify a need, it's also a demand for love. Now, love would be here, this would be the place where we would define as the demand for love. Because it has nothing to do with need. It's not a biological, bodily, let's say, need. It's something that happens the moment that language enters into our domain. When language enters, it tells us something about the need, but it also expresses something else. You can see that babies sometimes cry and they don't really need food. They just need their daddy or mommy to come into the room, right? And that would sort of make them stop crying because they've expressed a demand for love and not a demand to satisfy a need. Okay, are we here? I'm repeating these concepts, but they just represent the same thing that we're drawing here. Okay. So, on one side, there's where a demand is more than a need. And on the other side, there's where need is more than a demand. Any ideas? When a need is more, what does this mean? We deliberated that to some extent in our group. Something in my need for, let's say, nourishment is not completely captured by language, right? Something from this very instinctual need gains no designation in language. Language is unable to deal with it, right? There's some part of it. There's something about this very internal thing. When I try to express it, I lose it. Yeah? A simple example. You ask me, who am I? Yeah, I tell you, okay, I'm Leon. Doesn't really grasp everything which is me, let's say, at least according to my fantasies, right? So I'm saying, oh, I'm this guy that's making a lecture right here, right now. But still, that's not my essence, let's say, my substance, let's say. I can keep on talking, but it will never be it, right? There's something that's always missed out. Language is not perfect. That's something that's really hard to comprehend. We feel that language will create order in the world. Through language we can explain anything. And I mean also scientific language, also physics, let's say. But language in its essence has a blind spot. There's a very interesting mathematician named Gödel, which theorized that in math. He said every formal system, every coherent formal system always has a blind spot. And it's a fact of language also here. Something from the dimension of need is not grasped by language. I am left with something that my cry does not express. Now, this is a very interesting metaphysical figure, right? Because let's say everything we can describe, everything we can say something about is here in language, right? And you ask me, okay, what is not in language? What is that thing that was never in language? I can't really tell you. Anything that I will say will miss out. That's the whole idea, right? It's exactly the point where language misses out inherently, right? So Freud has an interesting solution to that, or just a notion about that. This part of a need is what is primally repressed. Okay, and this is a very interesting concept. There is repression. You probably have heard about repression. It's a mechanism that Freud has specifically attributed to neurosis. It's a way where I can live in a world which is bearable without me constantly having to deal with unbearable things. Right? When, very simplistically, we could say when an idea and an effect which corresponds to this idea sort of doesn't really fit with my ego, like with what would be pleasurable to me, I repress it. It goes to the unconscious, it stays there. Right? That's repression. Primal repression is something else. Primal repression is a constitutive mechanism. Repression is something that happens always, all the time, but primal repression starts the story. It's the first negation. Now, there's an interesting way to look at it, and in order to sort of grasp it, we need to differentiate between two concepts. One is a lack, and the other is a loss. A loss is, let's say, I had this marker, and I lost it. So a loss necessarily entails the existence of an object which precedes its disappearance or negation, let's say, if we call it very simplistically. So that would be a loss. An object was there and now it's gone. We can say repression is sort of like this kind of a loss. Yeah? We lose something from consciousness. But primal repression has nothing to do with loss. It has to do with lack. Lack is, let's say, a void which we can assume was always there. There was no object before. It's a lack that was perpetually lacking forever. Okay? Primal repression is the first instatement of lack. So it is a lack. It is not that something was there. Because again, we cannot express what was here. There's no way that this gained existence in psychic reality, because psychic reality has to go through language. Existence, reality, we're talking about semiotics here. The things, the objects, let's say, they're not there in the world per se. They're the signified, which is engendered by a play of signifiers. So it's all happening here. So this thing.
So how do we even know that there is a lack?
So what Freud says that we have to necessarily assume that this happened. Yeah? We have to necessarily assume that something in the realm of need was not captured by language, right? And we necessarily assume that it was never there in the first place from the perspective of language. So the only thing we can assume is that here there is a lack. Freud says it's a primal repression. This is sort of like an active mechanism, right? And we can say this is the first action or act that the subject takes according to psychoanalysis. I'll give an example, and I'll go back to Freud, because this is a good question. Lacan gives the example of the robber, which comes to a person with a gun, and he says, your money or your life. And this is a choice, let's say. You can choose your money or your life. But if we look at it closer, we see that it's not really a choice between two things. Right? It's not that I can choose either money or life, because if I choose money, I lose money and life. So it's sort of like a very strange logical disjunction, because usually a disjunction is either A or B, or the two of them, etc. But this is a disjunction that says, oh, your money or your life, you can only choose life. But when you choose life, it is necessarily engendered with a lack. Now, when we think about this money, cannot be thought as something that we had at some point and we lost. The moment where life comes into existence is engendered, it is engendered with a loss. We can call it money, but we can also call it the primally repressed. We can also call it the primal lost object. So this would be a primally repressed sum of excitation, like we said, like this body is like a sum of excitation. Some of it never got into language. In the first moment was sort of like negated, and all we have in language is sort of like a lack. That's all we have there. Yeah? Now, Freud relates primal repression to the division between the conscious and the unconscious. If we go back to Freud. Because he says, if repression functions by pushing an idea to the unconscious, we have to necessarily assume that such a division is created at some point. He says we cannot just assume that there is a division and then repression functions. We have to create this division. Primal repression is what creates this division, according to Freud. Yeah, but we digress a bit. Okay, but just to clarify this idea. Now, in order to sort of get this like lost object here, what was primarily repressed, because this thing sort of haunts us. Okay, in a second I'll demonstrate. We can look at it as like what Buddha says about desire, and we're getting to desire in a second. Buddha says that it doesn't matter what you do. If you desire something, you can either get it, and then desire will sort of grow for another thing, or you can desire something and never get it. Second option is suffering, right? You desire and you never get what you want or what you desire. The first option is also suffering, because you perpetually desire forever, never truly ending this sort of progression. We can say that the primally repressed object is exactly that thing which never stops bothering us, right? There's never a way to fill that lack, because there was never money in the first place. There was nothing there in the first place, so we can never get it. Doesn't matter how much we try, we never get that first thing. Okay? Any question until now?
I don't mind this example, I have to say.
Okay.
I've heard it for a fair time, and I've been thinking about it quite a lot, and I think this material status of money makes it harder actually to grasp than if it was like happiness, for example.
Right.
Life or happiness.
Life or happiness. Then we wouldn't be robbed, right? Robbed of your happiness, right?
Yeah, then you never had it, and then what makes it more realistic? Because in this case, like I imagine me having the money.
Yeah, it's true. It's quite confusing. Yeah.
When you were talking about Buddha, I was thinking about Schopenhauer, who was referring to this as well. And then I think happiness, according to the example, is also more coherent.
So life or happiness, you say?
I'm just thinking about better one. Now I'm on life and happiness.
Maybe a check.
Huh?
Maybe a check.
Maybe a check.
You don't have it yet, but you will maybe desire.
Interesting. Yeah.
Well, I have a problem with the story.
Yeah.
About the coming to the end of language.
Mm-hmm.
Of the demand expressing the need in language. the reality of baby. Because the baby, I mean, this thing, how does the baby express his needs? He cries. Well, there are many things happen before the baby cries, and the baby is he's trying to suck. Okay, so he's doing the movement with his lips. He doesn't try to express anything. He's not applying to anyone. Just moves his mouth because he has an instinct which drives him to do a movement with his mouth. And this movement is being interpreted by a mother or whoever who wants to appease a need she assumes, and this for me this fact of the baby moving his body in accordance to impulses, move like he needs to pee, so he makes a movement before he pees. So actually, there is a way, for example, to take care of babies without diapers, because you can feel the baby when he wants to pee, so you react to that. And the appearance of love as at this point is for me is in some way wrong. So I would really, I mean, I also said, I talked about it also last time, I really, I would put love on this side of the scheme, and on that side, there would be something else, something like what the demand afterwards, when there is a demand that is much later, a few months later, in the development of baby, there is like maybe he demands something he doesn't really need, and that wouldn't be love, because love he does need, and the demand. I don't know. He wants to appease here his need to suck, and then he gets milk, and that's wrong. So he made a demand in the language which, so the milk would be the wrong, what the demand expresses, and was not included in his need. So I don't know.
Okay.
It's all for me. It's really.
Yeah. I think I got what you're saying, and you're right. This is a story, and obviously it's much more intricate than that. So let's clarify some things. When we think about language, and when I'm saying language, a lot of people think about words or concepts, like even the concept of, I don't know, milk, or the concept of love, let's say. These are sort of linguistic elements. But when I'm talking about language in this sense, I'm not talking specifically about words. It could be anything, right? It could be anything which has a signified, right? Anything which signifies something. So when I say that, when Lacan says that a baby cries, it's true. The cry is sort of like a demonstration, right? But even in the womb, before even being born, and even before even starting to, let's say, suck the milk like babies do, in the womb the baby is already exposed to language, right? Language as whatever the mother speaks, or what he hears from the outside, or the way that these internal stimulations in his body, its body, his or her body, interact. And at this moment, there is already an appeal to language. Now, when we say language in this sense, we don't mean language as like the actual cry for the mother, I'm crying, I want milk, but like you said, these movements. There's already an articulation of the body. There's a way to say, okay, this movement interacts with this sensation. There's already an act of representation, right, being done in a very, let's say, on a very low level, right, without the use of concepts. Now, when we say that the baby appeals to the mother, we also say that the baby appeals to the other. So, in this sense, we're saying that these interactions, these movements, are never done in sort of like a secluded world where only the baby exists, but they're done using, let's say, signs which are sort of adopted with the assumption that they mean something. Right?
The mother.
That?
The assumption of the mother.
The assumption that they mean something for someone. Yeah, the assumption that these movements actually make sense. Okay, and we'll be talking about a very, very, very low level, right?
This is happening afterwards, like nachträglich.
Well, afterwards this complexifies. Afterwards the baby, let's say, makes a cry, and then the mother tells him, oh, you're tired. Oh, you want me to come, right? She sort of tells him, what is this, right? She gives him words or descriptions to sort of say, what is this part which is more than the need? What is this part in your, let's say, your interaction with the world, or these feelings that you relate, if we'll be Kleinian for a second, if you relate to the bad mother, to the bad breast or the good breast. These are very, like, these are pre-Oedipal, like, sort of concepts. So the mother tells them, okay, so this means that. That's a higher level of acquisition of language, right? But when we talk about this, we talk about the very, very, very first moments of subjectivity in the world. This can happen in the womb, right? So already like an assumption that something means, that these minute, let's say, ways that the baby controls the environment or its body means something for someone, right? That is the assumption. When we use signs, we necessarily assume that they mean something for someone.
But this use is not the first thing that happens. The first thing that happens is a movement that is, it's more like what you said about language in Jewish culture.
Interesting, yeah.
As language is a part of the like being the expression, which is only afterwards it's understood as an expression. It's a movement from which doesn't have a meaning. It has a meaning only afterwards. It is uncomfortable. Something is uncomfortable in the body.
Yeah.
So
something is uncomfortable. Well, let's carry on with that, and we'll do. Something is uncomfortable. That is the point. So let's say there's and we're getting to this in 1 second, like in 1 second when we get to Lacan's interpretation of the Oedipus. But let's say there's a mythical state, this state where the baby is one. There's no division. All the needs are necessarily pacified immediately. Like in, let's say, this very weird state in the womb, which is totally hypothetical, because even in the womb the baby experiences discomfort, right? But let's say there is a mythical state preceding primal repression, preceding the appeal to the other, preceding the use of language, where everything just functions, right? This is like heaven, I don't know, nirvana. But at the first moment, that happens already in the womb, that the baby feels a certain discomfort, an excitation which does not fall into place. This has to mean something. This is already a division. This is already me and something alien. If in the first moments it's only me, at this moment there is me and the other, right? Something is there which excites me and doesn't really sit with this, let's say, mythical, complete and whole image of myself, or like state, right? In this first moment is already a split, right? Okay. Okay, so we'll deliver that later, yeah? Yes? Mm-hmm.
You say that then love is taught to the human being.
Well, definitely we would say that the demand for love is unconditional because there's no way to actually pacify it, but the baby learns from its history what is that. And we see that we demand different things from the people that we love. And we can say that at this point in the baby's life, he sort of learns some things about this. What is this love that I seek? Right? So yeah, he gains, his mother says, oh, so you want me to cuddle you, maybe, right?
Maybe that's too radical to say, but love can be understood as construction in language.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
But not like the signified love.
Right, right.
Signifier love.
Right. This is like the place in language which we sort of preserve for whatever belonged to mother, and I wanted more than these needs that she pacified for me. Right? This is the place we preserve in language for that. But guys, again, if we stay on the level of the demand for love, we get to a very pathological form of love. Right? People that demand the love of their partners, really demand it. Give it to me. And how can we actually give that? What is this love that we seek? We seek that place in the other which is capable of loving or desiring. So we desire that. We demand that. Right? We demand that place in you that gives love. How can we pacify that? Maybe we can send flowers to our loved one. This is my love. But that's not enough, right? Demand for love is not pacified with that. So you move in together. This is my love, but that's not a love. So we'd say like a relationship that's sort of based on a demand for love and doesn't go to the level of fantasy, which I'll draw right here in a second, is kind of a hard relationship. It's hard. We all went through it, right? Some of us even got out of it, or progressed, or how Hegel says we use the Aufhebung, sublimation, right? So I'm going to draw another circle right here, which is, some of you might be surprised. So this circle I would define as the place of desire, right? Now, a desire is an Aufhebung in two senses, according to Lacan, from both sides, both from the side of demand and both from the side of need. So a desire, what we would also situate here, the object of desire, is engendered with these two qualities of these two, let's say, subtracted aspects of our encounter with language. From the side of demand and the demand for love, desire would gain its unconditional character. Also, there's nothing specific which can make desire sort of stop forever, right? Let's say, and it's only a hypothetical, it's a hypothetical saying, and you hear that sometimes when you read Zizek. He says, the worst thing that can happen to a person is to find the object of its desire, of his or her desire, right? It's a catastrophe. It's impossible. The only, let's say, subject that has the object of desire in their pocket would be a psychotic, according to Lacan. So when Zizek says that, he says, yeah, it's destructive because it means you're psychotic, yeah? Which sometimes is a problem. Yeah? But for neurotics, the object of desire is never in our pockets. And we constantly complain, oh my God, I just can't find rest. Oh, it doesn't matter how much I try. Doesn't matter how many women or men I date, it doesn't stop. So desire gains this unconditional character of the demand for love. So there's nothing specific which desire can point to. And on the other hand, it gains from whatever is primally repressed, this lost object, which constantly haunts us because it was forever lost, perpetually lost, lacking, like we said. It gains its, let's say, incessant character. The fact that, what I wrote here, it's insatiable, right? There is no way to make it stop. So desire gains these characteristics and manifests right here as the third circle in our diagram. And in this sense, we have three lacks represented in this diagram, right? We have the lost object, whatever was primarily repressed, that's a lack, right? We have the lack in language, whatever language cannot articulate in the dimension of need, right? That's a lack right here. And then we have a third lack, which is the place or the site of the object of desire. It is sort of the demarcation of the object of desire. That's how we use desire. We lean on it. There's a place, at least. There's a place to desire safely even, right? So let's say a better relationship would sort of lean towards here. Right? We always demand love, but then maybe we should work together on a shared fantasy. Right? That would be a good relationship, I think. Now, back to the phallus, because we've been blabbering about it, just a second. Back to the phallus, and then we'll have some more question. The phallus is exactly the thing that nails these three together. Okay, so it is, let's say it is that aspect in language, right, which is right here. It nails them all together. It's like a nail. I'd even venture to sort of like draw this right here. You know, why not? You know, the phallus is the nail that nails all these three together. And I'll give you like a metaphor that I sort of like thought about. So the phallus would be a non-existing nail, yeah, which fixes an empty picture frame to a wall that is not there. Okay, so we're talking about three lacks, right? So in this sense, reality, our psychic reality, existence, is an empty picture frame which is fixed with a non-existing nail to a wall that is not there. Imagine it, it's sort of like, yeah? The phallus is that nail, it sticks out. That's a very important thing to remember. It sticks out, thus holding the structure together. Okay? Okay, so let's do a small break for a question. We'll continue. Yes?
No, it was exactly the question about this point where they meet. Like, I was wondering what's the representation in the language of those three.
Right.
And there is no, because then the phallus doesn't have representation in the language in a sense.
I would say, and we'll see this right now, the phallus is there as lack in all of these senses.
So I'm just wondering if this space should be marked onto the top, or
this one?
maybe it should be empty.
This one is a, yeah.
Like linguistically, because like that's marks I understand as a space for language.
Right, but then the phallus is not nothing.
It's everything.
Well, it has to be something, or actually it would be better to say it is not nothing.
It is not nothing, but
yeah.
Does this exist in the language?
Of course, in the sense, of course it does, because actually the phallus function enables you to say a chair without naming a concrete one. Imagine to say like concrete thinking. Imagine your head say chair, and already being stuck in your mind with this one chair. That would be like a collapse in your mind. There is no space, no time, no reality. Phallus is this frame that lets you think chair, but your mind is open to think about every single chair in this.
But I understand it, but I understand it as you said, as a function. So that
it's a matrix of, okay, yeah.
Well, we have a simple answer for that. It's a signifier.
Exactly.
Okay.
It gives you the space in your head to think.
It's a unique signifier.
Yeah.
No, but that's then the empty space on the left side.
Here?
Mm-hmm.
No.
That would be where language sort of misses out on.
Exactly.
So this would not be where signifiers sort of exist, right? The question is how to draw these circles. It's a terrific question. And this is what Lacan refers to as the Viremia Knot. I sort of used it here. Lacan doesn't use it here. Yeah, I sort of used it here. Sort of like to play with your imagination. It's an interesting use. But I mean, in a second we'll draw it again. But I mean, what stands here, it's a great question. And sometimes it's the object A, object petit A, which can be translated as the object cause of desire or the object of desire. So it's a very interesting question. Eventually in seminar 23, we don't have a nail holding them in. We have this sort of what Lacan defines as a symptom. It's not a symptom, it's an inventive symptom. It's terrifically fascinating. And I think we'll briefly talk about it in the last 5 minutes of this lecture. Okay, just by implication even. Okay? Yeah, let's do a couple of quick questions. Yes.
Very stupid question maybe, but I just don't get why you call it phallus.
Well, that's a great question. Keep it for later. Okay? It's a very common question. I've heard it a million times. Okay, but we'll answer it. Don't worry, but keep it for later. Okay? Yeah. Somebody else? Yeah.
Well, I counted in your metaphor. I counted only until 2. There was the
Nail.
No, the nail of the phallus. Okay.
Right.
And there are 3 domains here.
Mm-hmm. The nail, the picture frame.
The nail is not a domain.
No, the nail is the phallus. Picture frame would be a psychic reality, which is a frame for the object of desire. Right? That is only where the object of desire can appear. Think about the picture. Think about going to a museum. Like, think about looking at a picture. Something is there in the frame. It is framed and it gets its place. And then we have the wall. Right? The wall would be... Yeah, right. We would say the wall is sort of the limit, our limitations. Whatever the picture cannot say anything about that. So let's say, or at least in classical art, that's where contemporary art goes beyond. But let's say the picture tells us something about the picture. Beyond this, the wall, it's sort of like it is where it is hanged. There's nowhere else to hang it, right? That's sort of it limits the capacity of our reality. There's something in reality which is, it doesn't matter how much we fantasize or use language in inventive ways. There's a limit. There's a limit. Death is a limit, right? So the wall would be death, maybe. Yeah. Maybe. Continue? Yeah. Okay. So now we venture to seminar 4, which is called the object relations, which I think it's one of the only seminars that doesn't have like a full English translation, even not an underground one. But it has some segments translated, if you're interested. And in this seminar, Lacan takes whatever he wrote in The Signification of the Phallus, and if I'm not mistaken, that was a year before. And in this seminar, he sort of progresses it to his interpretation of the Oedipus complex. So what we have, this progression between need, demand, and desire, is incorporated to Freud's Oedipus complex. So let's do it. What Lacan does is he takes the ternary domain of the Oedipus complex, and you remember who the stars are there, right? It's obviously the mother, the child, and the father. And he adds the phallus as a 4th term. So now it's not 3, it's 4. And even more interestingly, it manifests in all of these domains as a representative or a signifier of lack. Right? Here it would be a real lack, here it would be an imaginary lack, and a symbolic lack. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with these terms are terms which are widely used by Lacan from a certain stage. We call them the registers, right? These are the 3 registers. Real, symbolic, and imaginary. Today we won't go deeply into this theory, but let's say, according to Lacan, there are 3. So, Oedipus complex is a story, so let's start telling this story. Okay, the story begins with what we described earlier as the mythical pre-Oedipal stage. right? What we described as a stage where there's no division in the world, in the universe, in existence. There's only oneness. It's kind of hard to grasp because any word already entails a division. Like any thought, any concept already entails a division. But let's hypothesize about this like amazing stage where there's no division. The child is immediately satisfied, always. Anything that sort of surges up in terms of bodily excitement is immediately pacified and directly pacified. So there's no need to actually address even the universe. Everything just works out. We say there's a constant presence of the mother. And again, I'm saying mother, and I'm not implying that all caretakers are mother, but again, in the Oedipal terms, we would say there are two actors playing as caretakers, and Freud calls them mother and father. Of course, we can talk about a father and father in gender terms, etc., but let's keep it in classical Freudian terms. So there's a constant presence and connection to the mother. So this state, the mythical state of the oneness of unity, is purely hypothetical. Right? We just have to assume that this state existed before, because there is a state of division after. So we sort of assume logically that if there is a mechanism or a procedure which creates a division, this is hello, let there be light, okay? We assume that before that it was sort of like no division. Okay? It's just a logical assumption. Now, the first moment the Oedipus complex begins, let's say is initiated, is the moment where the real phallus shows its face. I don't know if it has a face, but it shows itself. This is the beginning of the Oedipus. So before that, we're talking about pre-Oedipal, sort of like, it's kind of hard to even deliberate that, but we sort of assume that state, and then the mythical state is broken off, right? This unity is not united anymore. Something is cut out. Something is carved out, dividing the child and the mother. So we can say that if the, let's say, state of unity is like a perfect sphere, perfect circle, everything is there, right? In this stage, we have sort of something which is cut out and divides the child from the mother. Again, where do we start counting? In 1 or 2? This is the same idea. So we start with the child and the mother, and this is actually a state where the mother just doesn't answer all the needs of the child immediately. Yeah, it already happens in the womb. Like, there's some things which happen in the body which are just not very pleasant, and they're not pacified immediately. So in that stage, there's already a division, so already a distancing, right? We can say that this is the moment where the child is hungry and the mother doesn't come. Again, we're using this example, which is kind of problematic, but maybe it will help us to grasp it. The child is hungry, the mother is not there. So what is introduced here is the absence of the mother. Right? If in the mythical stage there's a constant presence of the mother, in this stage absence is introduced. Yeah? The absence of the mother on the dimension of need. Now, when the child has need and it's not pacified, in this sense, it is frustrated. This is what Lacan defines as primordial frustration. Primordial frustration relates to the, let's say, even the body of the mother. Let's say the mother has this body which is there sometimes and sometimes not, and it marks the body of the mother with a lack. Now we define this lack as a real lack. It's a lack which is engendered in the real. Now think about primal repression for a second. We talked about it just 10 minutes ago. We said it is a lack which was never included in language. It was never there in the first place. That would be a description of this kind of a lack, right? It's not a lack that we can sort of fill out in the sense that we yearn to. It is a lack that was constituted as lack. So here we can mark the phallus. I'll mark it as a phi, and I'm sort of like relating it to the mother. So on this stage, the lack is attributed to the mother itself. Something is lacking there in the body of the mother. Now, if we read Freud, if we go back to Freud, this has to do with Freud's argument that the phallus initially lacks on the body of the mother. Now, I'm not talking implicitly, I'm just talking explicitly. The mother just doesn't have the penis, according to Freud, and that's very, very anxiety-provoking for the child, for the, let's say, male child, at least, in that sense. And what Lacan is saying is that when we're talking about the real lack of the phallus, we can relate it to Freud's theory in that sense. But again here, and you remember our discussion about need, and this is the first lack. The lack on the side of need, what is primally repressed. Okay, so we have this real phallus, first appearance. After this stage, I'm going to just write, okay, imaginary phallus. So, the imaginary phallus is introduced, and this is the phallus introduced as an imaginary lack, meaning in the sense of the image, let's say, something which is sort of like a gestalt functions. Yeah, it is not a sentence, it is not a word, it is sort of something which is just grasped and comprehended as an image. At this stage, the baby attempts to make sense of this lack. Why is mother lacking? Why is she not here? What does she have that is so interesting for her that she is not with me? What is that thing? Again, this is the question, what is the phallus? Right? So the child is asking, what is lacking on the side of mother, and what does mother desire beyond the child? So these are the questions which represent the appearance of the imaginary phallus. And what the baby attempts to do is sort of to fill this lack, fill it in. But on this level, it is filled up with what Lacan defines as a sequence of images. Okay, well, you have to think about like a certain stage where we can't really explain what's going on, but there's sort of like these images which are internalized and related to the lack of the side of the mother. Now, these images have to do, on the one side, with different objects that the baby associates with the mother's desire beyond him. Right? Whatever the baby sort of associates to the mother's desire, what she wants beyond him in the world. That's on one side. And on the other side, it is also related to anxiety-provoking images, yeah, which have to do with the father's prohibition. Again, we're talking about the Oedipus complex. And according to the Freudian terminology, this lack is engendered initially by the father's prohibition. The father says no. He creates a cut, right? Something in the relationship between the child and the mother cannot exist. And Freud talks about the prohibition of incest, right? That is the thing that father just does not approve of. In this sense, the imaginary phallus materializes in the psyche or in psychic reality by a sequence of images which on the one side represent the desirable objects which draw mother away from the baby, and on the other side represents his, let's say, his aggressive identification or aggressive tendency towards the father as the one that created this gap in the first place. Right? So in this sense, this stage is the very classical Oedipus stage, right? Where the child wants the mother but hates the father, wants to kill him. This is classical Oedipus complex, right? This is where the child is situated in this stage, and the general question is, how can I be this for her? in the sense of replacing father, or in the sense of just finding whatever she wants beyond me. And being that, I want to be her object. I want to be the object of my mother's desire. So this would be the quest, or the imaginary quest, at this sense, at this point.
This is equally true for female.
Sorry?
This is equally true for
It is not equally true, but yes, the question is, what is it and how can I be it is asked. But then the Oedipus complex gets a different resolution. So we'll talk about that a bit in the last couple of minutes, okay? But definitely it's not equal. There is a difference. There is a sexual difference, and it also manifests here. But due to lack of time, we won't really delve into that. But right here, I'm sort of relating the phallus to the child. Why? Because the child constantly wants to be in its place. To be in its place is what the mother desires, or whatever the father is giving her. So he wants to be her object. He wants to be the phallus. So this would be what we call an imaginary identification with the phallus. The child concocts this series of images, these sequence of images, and he tries to take its place. That is me. Yeah? I'm a good boy. That's why you should love me. Right? But, unfortunately, there is an impasse. There is an impasse because it doesn't matter how much the child tries to narcissistically identify with the image of the phallus, sort of make it itself, it can never really fill in this real gap. And this is in several senses. First, because we said that this gap is unfulfillable. That's just a logical sense. Second, we say that in the Oedipus, incest is prohibited. There is no way to go beyond that, right? And if we want to look at it on the even more real sense, the child's, let's say, real phallus, or let's say, does not solve this problem of this initiatory gap. So the child is sort of like, okay, again, this is only a story, no child is sort of like, okay, so I want mom and I want to kill dad, but then my imaginary identification with both these objects which I sort of relate to them doesn't work. No, it's not like that, but we're talking about a structure. So at this point, an impasse arises. Imaginary identification does not provide a substitute for whatever was initially lost, and the child turns into the final, let's say the final representation of the Oedipus in what we would define as the symbolic phallus. You can notice that at this stage of Lacan's teaching, the symbolic is very important. It's sort of like, this is the way to solve the Oedipus. Okay, we go there. So, if you can't beat them, join them, right? That's what goes on this stage. And the child says, okay, no, I will not identify with the phallus as an object. By the way, a lot of people still do it today. They just don't give up. They're still looking to identify with the image of the phallus, of having it or being it, right? Really, really looking hard to do that. But let's say the baby that's sort of going to overcome the Oedipus complex, right? He says, no, I'm not going to identify with the phallus as an object. I will identify with the father as the bearer of the phallus. You see the difference? I'll draw it here. So I'm adding this third circle again, and now I'm putting the phallus on the side of the father. So, I'm not identifying with this object that I think, that I imagine is situated there in the place of the real lack. I identify with the position from which this phallus is situated. Okay? In the sense of asking ourselves questions. Who am I? Or like, who am I? I will say this would be my imaginary identification, my imaginary idea of myself. I am this person. I like doing that, and I enjoy these kind of people. But then when we look at symbolic identification, we're not looking at what I think I am, we're sort of asking, from where do I imagine I am observed when I say that I am like that? Right? So it's not the objects, it's from where the object is engendered. And as we said, the only place for the object of desire to be engendered is in language, is in fantasy, is in articulated fantasy. Now, the position of the father as the bearer of the phallus, or the phallus-bearing father, right, it's an authoritative position. What we accept is an authority. Think about this in Oedipal terms. We accept the authority of the prohibition of the father. This is in Freudian and Oedipal terms. In Lacanian terms, we're talking about the authority of the law. In a couple of senses, in the same senses we can sort of think about the other. Some of them, like language. We're talking about the authority of language in the mediation of our enjoyment. Right? That's one. The other is in society and culture. We sort of accept the way the world is compiled according to our social norms. We accept the prohibition of incest. That would be a good example, because the prohibition of incest is not strictly a linguistic law, right? So, the child accepts the authority of the father, it thus gets rid of this unbearable anxiety that had turned him to constantly try to identify with the image of the phallus, and gains access to several things, which are they're great. First of all, he gains access to symbolic reality, to reality which is mediated through language. He gains access to mediated enjoyment. It's not this excitation, unbearable excitation. It is sort of framed. Yeah? We can gain satisfaction through language. Right? And he gains access to the dimension of desire, which lies beyond demand and need, beyond the demand for love. This is what Lacan relates to the name of the father. If you've heard of this, this is sort of what is accepted or inscribed in psychic reality in order to gain access to these dimensions. Here in this same drawing, this same diagram that we've seen just a second ago, again, this is the Viremia Knot of the, this would be the symbolic, the real, and the imaginary. This time, we're defining it according to the dimension of lack the phallus represents.
Shouldn't be the other way around? Imaginary next to mother?
So mother would be where the real lack is situated.
Oh, yeah.
The child will try to put himself in the place of the imaginary lack. And the father would introduce the lack in the symbolic, the place of the object of desire. Right? Okay, very briefly, we'll go over what is called sexuation and what it has to do with the phallus. Because if you read the signification of the phallus, you would see that Lacan defines the function of the phallus as a knotting, as tying something together. And he says it's on the side of the symptom, and this is what we have here, sort of like how the symptom manifests. And on the other side is sexuation, the way we come into the world as a masculine or feminine subject. Now, to your question, why call it phallus? Why call it feminine? Why call it masculine? Right? Lacan is a Freudian, right? So he's relying on Freudian teaching. He says to his students at some point, "You might call yourselves Lacanians, but I am a Freudian." Right? So when Lacan takes these models and concepts from Freud, the Oedipus complex, he has a choice. He can sort of like change the terminology and like draw this, just say real, imaginary, and symbolic, and say, hey, this is my theory, right? But then it would be kind of a like, just stealing something from another person and sort of saying, oh, this is a new theory by itself, right? But what Lacan is doing is relying on the Freudian models and keeping whatever Freud has provided in these models, but giving them a further interpretation. So again, the phallus is not the penis here, it is a signifier, and it means a variety of things, right? It sort of like relies on Freud and opens it up. In the same sense, sexuation talks about sexual difference, but not talks about sexual difference in the sense of sex, meaning, I don't know, whatever the biological meaning of that is, or in the sense of gender, how I define myself as a man or woman, not even in the sense of object preference. So you could like boys, you could like girls, you could like nor boys nor girls, it doesn't matter. We're still talking about a sexual difference between two types of subjects, and they're called feminine and masculine because it's all based on what we're talking about right now, about the Oedipal complex and the way the boy or the girl is situated there. Which question is asked in that story, right? So the question of sexuation, I said, is not sex, not gender, not object preference. It is how desire is structured, how this subjective desire is structured. And just briefly, very briefly, briefly stating, it is structured in two ways. It could be, and both of them are a question regarding the phallus. The first would be a question of having. What does daddy have that he gives mommy, and then I sort of miss out on something? Like, what does he have that makes mommy give him what I want so much? Right? So this is a question of having. And I think like the best way to sort of like simplistically think about these social or psychological concepts is going to the most obscene representations in Hollywood, right? Or other realms. But think about men, for instance, and their quest for power or for beautiful cars, great suits, etc. It is sort of that by doing that, they have something. They sort of say, I have something. They sort of say, I have the phallus. That's one way to do it, and we can say that's the way Dad did it, right? It's adopting the authority of the law in order to find a substitute. So for boys, the substitute for this lack of the phallus would be having something. Well, it doesn't have to be cars, but it can be having something. So we would say that if you're a man or a woman, or whatever way you articulate yourself in sense of gender, if your desire is a desire that functions in this direction, in the direction of having something, if whatever makes you wake up in the morning is the question, how can I have this thing which I originally lack and sort of try to fill in, then we would say you would be categorized or articulated as a masculine subject. I don't know which one of you is masculine. I cannot know by looking at you. Yeah? It's a question of desire. You know? It sort of directs the analysis. We would sort of direct the analysis in different ways for men and women in this sense. Okay? Now, the question for the feminine subject would be not a question of having, but a question of being, which is a more metaphysical question, I think. And the question is, what is mommy, or what mommy is that makes daddy give her what was originally taken from me? If we're talking about the girl originally castrated from the get-go. So what is mommy? And this is a different question, and again, if we go to Hollywood again and we go to what is this magical woman that is the phallus, and you know, it's not necessarily a woman with a lot of money or big cars or a lot of power. It's just a woman in a red dress, or a woman that not wearing even anything. It's sort of like it's a mystery. Yeah, it's not something that you can have. It is something that is inherently interior to you, which makes you into it. Right. So that would be a different question.
Isn't always a clear cut, or you have different?
So, again, Seminar 20 is a great place to look for answers for that. But we can say that masculine desire has one way to function, right? Having something in relation to somebody that has the object. So we need to have something in order to get the object from somebody that is internalizes it. Feminine desire, according to Lacan, has two dimensions. Right? It's not limited to masculine desire. It can be masculine. Feminine subject can enjoy, can desire in a masculine way. Of course, they have access to it, like all humans. That's why Freud says that the only libido is masculine libido. Right? Everybody has access to that. But according to Lacan, the woman is not all limited by that. There is another form of desire, which we could just briefly say is let's say, much harder to gain. It's utterly inventive. Right? It's an utterly inventive form of desire, meaning it is utterly singular. So we can say very simplistically that a feminine subject would have two trajectories. The ready-made one, like man, which could be like being a man, powerful, having cars, having suits, etc. Or on the other side can be being a mother, right? That would be like ready-made solutions, right? Or the very singular and utterly inventive one. Yeah? In Seminar 23, Lacan gives the example of James Joyce, which he claims uses language in an utterly inventive way. So he doesn't use language like regular writers do. He invents a new way of enjoyment. So Lacan would say that feminine subjects are open to that as well. Notice that Joyce was probably a man, yeah, but still we say that his enjoyment, his desire was functioning in this way. So this was a general brief sweep through several perspectives on the phallus that we did today, and we sort of jump between several seminars. I would just conclude. If we go back to the joke about Freud that we started with. So when there's another joke or just a comical conception of the phallus, that the phallus is an organ that can be raised by mere thought, right? So that makes him very special. But on the other hand, one has no real control over it. So there's sort of like a contradiction in this figure itself. Now, Saint Augustus, he claims that this is punishment for the, let's say, the audacity of man and his attempt to master the world. And I think what we've sort of underlined today, that we can relax a little bit about that and just understand that this contradiction or this whole thing, which is the phallus, is mere grammar, according to Lacan. Okay? And that's what we've tried to represent today. And thank you. I think we're done for today. And you can stay for questions. Thanks.